Hello class and welcome back to History 1120. Congratulations, you're done your first assignment. The quiz is completed. I've taken a brief look at them right now. It's Tuesday night when I'm recording this, and I'm pleased with what I'm seeing so far. I'm sure you all did very well in the quiz. As you can see, they're not really anything to be terribly afraid of. So good job. You're done your first assignment. We rattle on. The next assignment will be the research proposal, which is due on October 13th. And the proposal outline is already on Moodle. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming weeks, starting on Monday, about what is expected. But if you want to get an early jump on that, you can have a look at the outline that's posted on Moodle for that assignment. So today we're going to be starting a new section, the struggle for empire. We left off with a discussion of Acadia. We discussed the Filles du Roi, the daughters of the king. We talked about sort of bush masculinity, what it was like to live in New France. We're going to pick up that discussion today as well, and we're going to be discussing a rather unpleasant part of Canadian history, which is the Acadian expulsion. So let's get started. So why don't we begin again by discussing Acadia in even more depth, and we're going to race forward a little bit here to the 18th century. And again, as I've mentioned in the first few weeks, we are moving very quickly in terms of time period. This particular course encapsulates such a large period of time, and each century deserves its own bit of attention, but we have to move so quickly in these survey level courses. I do apologize for the speed with which we're moving, and again, the purpose of this is just to give you an introduction to this time period, and for more in-depth analysis of the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, that can be found in higher level courses. But for right now, we're racing to get up to Confederation pretty quickly. So as we've discussed with New France, where we said it's better to think of New France as more of a zone of influence than it is a physical territory, Acadia's kind of got the same sort of place in the historical record as well. Yes, it is a physical place, but it's also a society. As it says here on the slide, historians think of Acadia as a society as much as a place. After 1713, the French possessions in the region were both reduced and augmented. You might recall in their discussion of New France, and when we showed that large map of New France, French territories on North America in the earlier 17th century were massive, and they took up large parcels of land all the way down south as far as Florida and Louisiana. Well, this begins to change in the 18th century. Île-St-Jean and Île-Royale were some distance from the Bay of Fundy, where most of the Acadian settlements were located. Those were now under the nominal control of the British. Now again, we don't have time to get into the exact details of this, and in Belshot 6.10 it gets sort of a much more fulsome description of what occurred here. But essentially here, the British start to make inroads in new French territories, which makes sense if you think back to our description of just how much land was occupied by France. They're unable to defend it all at once, and sometimes begin to lose territory to the British. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 redefined the boundaries of Acadia in such a way as to worsen tensions between the French, the British, the Wabanaki Confederacy. You might recall our discussion of them before in terms of aligning themselves with the Acadians, and the Acadians themselves. So this is an important moment in history, certainly in 1713, and this sort of redefinition of boundaries is a major reason why the 18th century plays out the way it does in this region. And you can have a look here at the actual text of the Treaty of Utrecht in this picture. You can see it's written out and it's all of its detail. Utrecht is often described, we're going to get on this in the next slide, for many different geopolitical reasons in the 18th century, but oftentimes outside of Canada, not enough attention is paid to how this specific treaty impacted Acadia and Eastern Canada in general for the next 100, maybe 200 years. Now, the Treaty of Utrecht itself ended the War of Spanish Succession, and it was a major moment of stalemate in terms of the power dynamics of continental Europe. In North America, one of the provisions of the treaty was France recognized the British claim over territory currently at that point occupied by the Iroquois, and ceded Nova Scotia and its claims to Newfoundland and the territories in Rupert's Land, all over to the British. So the French were massive losers in European theater of war, and then the result of that is a massive sort of transfer of land in North America itself. So again, imagine you're a member of a new French colony here, and you would have heard of the events going on in this faraway war that was taking place in Spain and all over the place in continental Europe, and yet very real consequences occur very quickly on the North American continent, especially on the eastern seaboard, regarding which group of people were controlling which parts of the land. The French portion of the St. Kitts and the West Indies was also ceded in its entirety to Britain. France retained its other pre-war North American possessions, including Cape Breton Island, where it built the fortress of Louisbourg, and then became the most expensive military installation at that time in North America. So again, France does maintain some of its possessions in the northeastern part of North America. However, this is a massive moment of shifting of powers in the region. So the British now control the region known as Acadia, but essentially there isn't much understanding about what that's going to mean. There isn't a massive overhauling of the affairs of Acadia yet, and from the British perspective, this is going to be a delicate situation. The British now have assumed control of people who are ethnically and linguistically French and have, as we've discussed last week, spent many generations intermarrying with Mi'kmaq people and have become a very distinct society, as we mentioned just last slide. Acadia is a location, but also a very distinct part of North American culture and a very distinct place. So it's very difficult to say for the British, okay, we're the new sheriffs in town, we won this war, or we won this peace, I should say, basically, in Spain. We signed this document in Utrecht. Let's everyone out of here, and let's run things according to the British way. So the story of Acadia from 1713, that's when the treaty was signed, to the 1750s, is sometimes referred to as Acadia's Golden Age, and it references the benefits of isolationism. By staying out of the way of wars, minimizing contact with their neighbors, and growing rapidly from internal sources, the Acadians were able to avoid combat deaths, epidemics, and internal division. So this period following British, again, quote-unquote, control, beginning in Acadia, you have this period of extreme growth in Acadian culture, and it comes in large part from staying out of conflicts in general. However, this is not supported by the evidence of extensive external trade and considerable immigration. A third of the individuals involved in 174 marriages in Grand Pre in the 18th century came from France, Ile Royale, and even Canada. Remember, that's its own distinct parcel of land at that point called Canada. Whatever caveats might be added to the story of a quote-unquote golden age, Griffiths is right in the key to understanding the more positive aspects of this community is that it sustained the Acadians for what came after 1748. So again, something that's very important to remember here is this period of expansion here from 1713 to 1750. Sometimes referred to as a period of isolation. Clearly there is historical evidence to the contrary that Belshot gets into that says this Acadian moment here from these 40 years basically is actually the Acadian culture codifying itself. It's the Acadian culture really fortifying itself as something distinct. And if it was not for this period, if it was not for this moment in Acadian history, likely what came next would have decimated and perhaps erased Acadian culture in general. Now, another conflict that took place from 1740 to 1748, the War of Austrian Succession, provided the French with an excuse to attack Nova Scotia from Louisbourg. Remember, that's where France has sort of doubled down on their last remaining strong outpost of French support, or French military support, I should say, in the maritime region. So Nova Scotia, which had been turned over to the British previously in Utrecht in 1713, was now attacked by the French. And this is ostensibly a French and English proxy war that's starting to take place in North America. In reply, New Englanders mounted an assault on the fortress and found its defenses to be easily penetrated. Louisbourg was captured in June of 1745, and for the next 3 years, the British and New Englanders controlled the whole of North American foreshore from Georgia to Newfoundland. That's an enormous sort of moment of the British seizing control. So again, the French ceding all of that territory except for Cape Breton and Louisbourg to the British, and then choosing to use Louisbourg, this very heavily fortified fort. If you've ever been to it or if you've ever seen pictures of it today, it's been maintained and is an amazing cultural heritage site now to this day. Choosing to attack from this point gave the British, and at this point again from the New Englanders again, it is important to keep straight that at this point, New England, the 13 colonies, were basically dealing with English and French colonies geopolitically at this point as well. So when they start attacking from New England, that's of course from the south. They took advantage of this situation to clear Ile Royale of several thousand Francophones, including many Acadians. This was a grim foretaste of things to come. So following this moment of attack, following this moment of provocation from the French towards the English who had essentially said, we're not really going to handle things with a firm hand in Acadia after taking over in 1713, things start to become a little more acrimonious between the English and their new colonial possessions. And the beginning of this is the clearing out of Ile Royale. Several thousand Francophones were cleared out of this territory, including many people who would later be expelled even further. So again, the British have taken over Acadia and Nova Scotia, this whole region, and have a new governor, Charles Lawrence. And he decides to push the issue of an Acadian oath of loyalty. The Acadians who remained in the Minas Basin and generally on the north shore of Nova Scotia were still reluctant. International circumstances had changed. So again, we discussed how now the choice of neutrality, which is something very, very important when we discuss conflict and when we discuss warfare. Neutrality is something that I think many people understand the idea of being neutral, staying out of conflict, right? Staying out of a large scale war or staying out of an argument or a dispute between nations. But neutrality is actually an extremely fascinating idea about who can be neutral, right? Who can enforce neutrality? And I think that one of the best examples of neutrality that's commonly used, certainly in the 20th century and perhaps in many centuries previous to this, is of course Switzerland. Now, I think Switzerland was one of the first countries that comes to mind when we think of neutrality, as they have claimed neutrality in many conflicts. But I think that it's important to keep straight in our minds the idea of pacifism as opposed to neutrality. So if a country wants to become neutral, if say the United States would like to invade Canada and they'd like to, and BC would say, well, we'd like to remain neutral in such a conflict. And they start an attack from the Vancouver shore and they're trying to move east towards Alberta. If BC was to say, nah, we're neutral, we don't want any part of this, would that spare BC from being attacked? That's the question you should ask yourself, right? If this was in a fanciful, never will happen situation. The ability to remain neutral does not mean you have no military presence, does not mean you have no military forces, does not even mean that you don't fight every now and again. In fact, fighting to remain neutral is a core principle of neutrality in the first place. Violating the terms of neutrality, like what happened to Belgium, has happened to Belgium twice in fact, is a serious sort of international offense. When a country declares neutrality and has that neutrality violated, it's a moment of pure aggression on the part of whoever violates the neutrality. But importantly, and in the case of Switzerland, is a great example. Switzerland has produced some of the world's most renowned fighting forces throughout the Middle Ages and into the 19th century as well. In fact, if you go to see the Pope in Rome, he's protected by the Swiss Guard, which are Swiss soldiers hired as mercenaries, known for their fearsome fighting abilities and devoted loyalty. The point I'm trying to make here about neutrality is great in and of its idea, and the desire to remain neutral is something that we see over and over and over again. But how realistic a concept is it if you don't have the ability to enforce neutrality? If you don't have the ability to defend yourself, if you are essentially at the whim of your opponents or the whim of your aggressors, it's a very, very tricky thing to negotiate. And certainly this is the case in Acadia. The Acadian response to repeated turnovers in imperial masters, you might recall the French controlled them and the British, they sort of reached this point of saying, look, we're not French, we're not English, we're Acadian. We don't care who's running things. We don't care if it's the British flag or the French flag. We're neither one of these people. We've been here for hundreds of years. We are our own distinct society. You may recall the discussion we had last class about intermarrying with Mi'kmaq and the distinct Acadian traditions that have evolved from there. You can see that there's this growing sentiment to say, I don't care who is running things. We are not your imperial subjects. We are our own distinct society. Now, if you're the British in this situation and you control this region, you might think to yourself, okay, well, we have to be very careful because we don't really want to piss off a whole bunch of people who are then going to make our lives a living hell fighting guerrilla war forever and ever and ever. However, from the British point of view, their claims to neutrality are undermined by the events at Louisbourg. How neutral can you be if from Louisbourg, a Cape Breton sort of stronghold and a French-controlled area, they attacked Nova Scotia. The error, I think, in the way of the British imagination here is to associate all French-speaking peoples as a homogenous group who all agreed on the same thing. So the new governor of Nova Scotia sees a lot of people speaking French and says to himself, these people look a lot like the same kind of people that keep trying to take over Nova Scotia. They keep trying to make trouble for us. This does not seem like a neutral people. They seem to have a predilection towards fighting for France, and certainly not for England. So we should probably make them be double sure of any allegiances towards the British Crown before we set down even more money and even more roots in this same region. Now again, here's where I'm going to use a Heritage Minute again. It's posted on the supplemental materials section of this week on Moodle, so you can have a look there. It is literally a minute, as the Heritage Minute suggests. It's worth a look. Now again, I will use Heritage Minutes frequently throughout this course, and not so much. I mean, yes, it does help. I think you all visualize what's going on here, and I think it gives you a good, quick summary of what some of these events are. But I always think it's important to note the narratives that are being ostensibly marketed towards Canadians regarding historical events. You have to view these Heritage Minutes not just as informative little television commercials, or, as you're probably more familiar, YouTube ads, but also as stories that are being told to the Canadian people, and for specific reasons. So again, have a look at that. It'll help you this week with your responses as well. So what do the Acadians say to this desire to take an oath of loyalty? Well, understandably, they say no, right? Further, Acadian refusal to take the oath in 1755 prompted Lawrence, with the support of Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, to begin relocating Acadians to the British colonies to the south, to France, to Louisiana, where they adopted Bayou life as Cajuns, to wherever they could be sent in general. The British forces set ablaze the emptied Acadian villages and then repopulated them with British American colonists, called planters, and by new immigrants from Yorkshire. So this is an extremely severe act by the British here, and this is not an act that is done with an eye towards peaceably governing the French-speaking peoples of Acadia. Certainly not. This is an act of, in some senses, it is referred to as many different things. It's referred to as the Acadian deportation. It's referred to as the Acadian expulsion. I'm not sure how the terminology is going to evolve, but it might evolve in a very specific way, and we're going to talk about this. Certainly we'd address this in your supplemental materials as well. This resettlement, deportation, all these words carry, I think, vaguely clinical and almost sort of bureaucratic connotations when we say, oh, deportation, expulsion. Truly what this was an act of ethnic cleansing. The idea was to try and get rid of as many Acadians as possible. The belief was, no matter what oath was taken or refused to be taken, these people would never be loyal to the British Crown. And their idea that they could become neutral French, to a British mind, that would have been impossible. The idea that French-speaking peoples in this region could be somehow distinct from the government of France. And there's evidence on many sides of this that suggests that, okay, well, maybe the Acadians weren't so neutral themselves, and yes, they kept fighting pitched battles, and there's some sympathy for the idea that the British thought that Acadians were if they had to choose between their imperial masters, would have chosen France. That being said, this style of governing conquered peoples, in the case of France and Britain in terms of their European conflicts abroad, this is a bold step and a very, very, very grave one in terms of the way Canada would be governed, and certainly the United States as well. As you can see, this is a British undertaking. This is before we have the United States of America, and this is a British sort of colonial practice, and I want you to keep in mind this practice of resettlement, this practice of ethnic cleansing, because it will come up later in this semester and possibly in the post-Confederation history course if you're taking it next semester. But if you're curious where the word Cajun comes from, or the idea of what Cajun is, I mean, it's actually very simple. Acadian, Cajun. I just gave you the linguistic origin of the word Cajuns. It's just a short term of the very quick way of saying Acadian, sped up. It's no more complicated than that. But their move to the remaining French colonial possessions in North America, which at that point were all over the place in North America, and many, many, many died on the journey. Many, many, many died on almost by design. You would definitely say, in terms of how we would evaluate these things in 2020, you would certainly say that their goal was not to peaceably redistribute these people into fine living situations. The idea was, we'll send them as far away as possible where they can't possibly foment insurrection against the British colonies here in the Northeast, and if they die, they die. Right? That's the British attitude towards this, summed up crudely. What do we make of this, right? You're all historians now. You're all in a history class, even though you're watching this on YouTube. You're all historians now. So we have to look at the evidence. We have to look at what occurred, and we have to look at what we know about British intentions and the amount of care and effort that would have been put in towards a plan that would have worked for, say, all French-speaking peoples in this region. Or was this a tactic of ethnic cleansing? Was it this strong word that we hear sometimes, where once you hear the word, nasty, horrible things come into your mind? And that's, of course, genocide. And there's a growing movement towards re-educating Canadians and perhaps reinterpreting the events of the Acadian expulsion as Acadian genocide. And that is, I think, ultimately going to be up to your generation of historians to sort of settle the facts on. I've posted a very persuasive article, I think, on the supplemental readings section that you're going to be reading for this week, that gets into greater detail in that regard. But this kind of act, what constitutes genocide? This is a very, very, very important question, I think, for Canadian history. And I think that a lot of you will see where we're going with this course when I've spent so much time in the Acadian story, because this is, in many ways, the first case study of British strategy towards dealing with minority groups on the North American continent. And in some ways, the Acadian example works very well for the British in terms of their designs in the region of the Northeast. And perhaps it informs the way that they deal with other groups in this region and other regions across North America, and perhaps even with a burgeoning American group that leads on into the 19th century as well. And here we will finish with the takeaway points from today's discussion of, frankly, just Acadia during this period. And there's an extremely important reason why we're spending so much time on Acadia. And I think if you're using your imagination, you can see why we decided to spend so much time on the way the British treated the Acadians. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 redefined the boundaries of Acadia in such a way as to worsen tensions between the French, the British, the Wabanaki Confederacy, and the Acadians themselves. It is important to note also that the Acadian allies, the Wabanakis, were constantly also fighting pitched battles against English settlement in this region as well. So this intermarrying and intermixing of cultures that was occurring between the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq and the Wabanakis at this point as well were also definitely, I think, casting dispersions upon the Acadians as a whole, in terms of, well, if we were to expel these people, maybe we'd perhaps stop this conflict with the Mi'kmaq in this region, which were fearsome battles that would take place. And Belcher, in the section of the textbook that you're reading for this week, describes these battles in more detail. The Acadian response to repeated turnovers in imperial masters and ongoing tensions was to seek a position as the, quote, neutral French. And you can understand their desire to do this, right? And you can understand the desire for the Acadians to say, we are not French, we are not English, we are neutral French, we speak French, capital F French, but we are not representatives of the French crown, for instance, right? Acadian communities enjoyed significant growth in this period, marked by natural population growth and increased farm productivity. That's an important region. This is an important part of the story of the region as well. That golden age, that period of expansion, really codifies Acadian culture, because if not for this period, we would be talking about a dead society. We'd be talking about a culture that had been wiped off the map, likely. But instead, Acadian culture survives in various forms, certainly in its original form in the Northeast, and also in its Cajun form in the southern United States as well. Renewed struggles between the French and the British, and between the British and the Mi'kmaq at the mid-century, resulted in more militarized region, and ultimately the Acadian expulsion. So there are military reasons for the expulsion itself, and the act itself is certainly an act of war. It is I think up to you to decide whether or not that is an act of genocide. I think that historians are coming around on that concept. I think our definition of genocide is far more nuanced than it used to be. We obviously do have the deaths associated with mass killings in this story as well, but there's also a more larger cultural genocide point that has been made in more recent years regarding the Acadian expulsion. Something that you're going to be considering in your responses this week. So again, these are the sort of key takeaway points, and thanks so much for listening, and I'll post a new video at the start of next week.